This video is brought to you by NordVPN. Check the link in the video description to get 70% off. Cast your minds back to mid-2018. Xiaomi launched the fantastic value Pocophone F1 to critical acclaim. The idea was simple: include lots of the bits that matter and leave out those that don't. What Xiaomi was packing is class-leading specs, a large battery, a decent screen, all in a polycarbonate package, and slapped a competitive $300 price tag on it. 21 months later, and Xiaomi has recently released this, the newly named Poco F2 Pro, and it's a bit of a confusing device. Let me explain. The Poco, not Pocophone, F2 Pro, there's been a branding change, is the kind of price to spec ratio of a traditional flagship killer. The base model, which I have here, is $499, which will get you 6GB of RAM, 128GB of storage, and there is an 8x256GB model too. Either one will give you a Snapdragon 865 system on chip, a 4700 mAh battery, a big OLED display, and a 64 megapixel camera setup on the back. On paper then, what's not to like? Do we really need to talk about speed? It's a flagship set of specs with flagship level performance. Whatever game you chuck at this thing, it will be able to handle it just fine. There was no question that this thing was going to be quick, and MIUI 11 is pretty smooth on the F2 Pro. I ran a suite of games including Real Racing 3, Fortnite and others that really did need to push the GPU with 3D graphics, and this thing ran pretty much flawlessly. Sure, you'd expect a phone with a Snapdragon 865 to be just fine, but with this price and this display and this battery and this build quality, it's impressive to say the least. MIUI is a little love-hate with me. I personally love the aesthetic and the feeling of using it, but there are a few things that I have a problem with. One, where are the navigation gestures? The 3-button layout is great, but we're almost all on gestures now, so they need to be brought in a software update. 2, if you're in an app and you click clear apps in the drawer, it doesn't close the app that you're in, it just puts you back into the app, which is kind of annoying. And 3, beauty mode is still a default setting in the camera app, and that's probably the most annoying one out of the 3. So in performance and software, this is business as usual. But it's now where things get a little bit confusing, because when I first saw the lack of 90Hz display or even 120Hz display, the inclusion of metal and glass, my initial impression was you're getting rid of something that's important and replacing it with something that isn't. But here is why I was wrong. You see, the original Pocophone had flagship specs with a mid-range shell. This time around, we've got flagship specs in a flagship shell. I genuinely don't feel like the lack of a 120Hz display severely impacts the overall user experience of the F2 Pro. The 6.67-inch Full HD Plus 60Hz OLED display in the F2 Pro is leaps, nay bounds better than its predecessor. Not only is it uninterrupted thanks to the use of a pop-up selfie camera, but it's bright, it's vibrant, it's sharp. As nice as it would have been to have a higher refresh rate display, I'm glad they left it out and left the price at $499. Any higher and you'd be getting pretty close to flagship territory. But here's the thing, while the original Pocophone felt like a flagship killer, it felt like a compromise, the F2 Pro feels like a flagship, and I really wasn't expecting that going into this review considering my use with the Pocophone F1. It's so ahead of its predecessor in terms of build quality and fit and finish and user experience that it doesn't feel like a flagship killer anymore. The neon blue unit that I have here does pretty closely resemble the OnePlus 7T from last year, at least from the back, and that phone is a flagship, not a flagship killer. Around the front, it kind of looks like the 7T Pro minus the annoying curves on the sides, since the Poco F2's panel is flat and it has a pop-up selfie camera. But the best bit is that we're treated to extras like dual SIM support, a headphone port, optical in-display fingerprint scanner, and an IR blaster. It's got pretty much everything you need. Now, there are some compromises, like the USB-C running at 2.0 speeds, the omission of a high refresh rate display or IP67 water and dust resistance, the lack of a telephoto camera, and no wireless charging. Also, that aforementioned fingerprint scanner isn't all that quick nor accurate. Actually, I found it to be pretty bad on my unit. But in my opinion, at this price, those are nice to haves and not need to haves. It's the same story with the charging. You get 30 watt fast charging, which, whilst not the fastest or most powerful in the world, is still rather impressive, topping up the 4700 mAh cell from 0 to 100% in just 64 minutes, with the included 33 watt charging brick. And that 4700 mAh battery got easily through a full day of setting up the phone, downloading gigabytes of apps and games, an average of 65% brightness, with some 100% usage out and about in my garden, a mix of 4G and Wi-Fi connections, and about 15 minutes of YouTube using the internal speakers. Throw in some Bluetooth connected earphones in there as well. I found it hard to end my day with less than 40% battery, so if you're not so hard on your device, expect 2 days of usage before needing to top up. And if you're more of a gamer, you'll be pleased to know that you should get a full day of playtime just fine. Unfortunately, I don't have time to play loads of games all day. Wouldn't that be nice? Before we talk about the important camera setup, we'd like to thank today's video sponsor, NordVPN. Staying safe online is a bigger concern now than ever before. NordVPN protects your privacy and lets you browse the internet from anywhere in the world. Having trouble streaming content that's blocked in your region? Worried about bad actors on public Wi-Fi? Check out the link in the video description to get up to 70% off. And thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Now, this next part is pretty important. The cameras are usually two things: a make or break feature on a modern smartphone and a compromise on less expensive smartphones. So, is the Poco F2 packing enough to impress? Well, on paper we've got a decent selection of hardware. There's a 64 megapixel Sony IMX686 sensor that bins down to 16 megapixel images. There's Ultra HD 4K video at up to 60 FPS and even 8K video at up to 30 FPS. 1080p goes up to 960 as well. Accompanying it is a 13 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 5 megapixel macro camera and a 2 megapixel depth sensor. In the pop-up module resides a 20 megapixel selfie camera too. Image quality is a bit hit and miss. While the 686 does manage to pick up a good amount of detail, it does sometimes come up with these weird noise reduction artifacts, even in daylight, which I thought was a little bit strange as they only tend to appear in certain parts of the image. Colours are nicely balanced in my opinion, no oversaturation here, which is nice to see considering that this is a Poco device and not a flagship, and its competitors do tend to overpower the colours. There is a bit too much contrast for my liking, and I feel like it can make a normal scene look pretty grungy and moody, though that might be your thing, it's not for me personally. Portrait mode isn't too bad, though it is likely thanks to the multiple cameras and sensors on the back. Edge detection seems to be decent with some very minor haloing around the subject where focus kinds of rolls off, though that's more of a processing artifact than actually a styling thing. It did get a little bit confused with my lockdown hair, but all things considered, I find it to be pretty acceptable. There is a significant drop off in quality when going from the standard camera to the ultra wide, which makes sense given the pretty radical change in sensor size and resolution. The colours don't change massively, but there is a drop in dynamic range with deep shadows becoming gloomier than real life. There are heaps of modes including a macro mode which was fun to play with since the F2 Pro actually does come with its own dedicated macro camera. It's kind of a gimmick if anything, and I think I would have preferred a 2x telephoto, but the quality isn't too bad and it was fun to play with like I said. Flipping around to the front, the F2 Pro selfies are a little bit soft and grainy, but with some solid dynamic range and accurate colours. I'm kind of glad that there's less noise reduction here as it could have led to more artifacts in selfies. The noise isn't awful anyway. Night mode is a little disappointing, it's exclusive to the 64 megapixel sensor and the processing isn't great. I noticed that it didn't seem to take as long to take the photo as other devices, so naturally there's going to be less data for the phone to work with there. This results in overly smooth, not necessarily amazing night shots with not a lot of detail and these weird blue/purple artifacts like a vignette around the image. Moving on to video, the Ultra HD 4K 60fps is exclusive to the main camera, with the ultra wide recording just 30 fps in 4K. Both of those are about 50 megabits per second. Footage seems to be a little bit shaky to me and there's a lot of contrast which results in videos that look kinda cheap. The steady video mode uses electronic stabilization and drops the frame rate from 60 to 30 and the resolution from Ultra HD to Full HD. It does the job, but it crops in a lot and the quality loss isn't something that I would call worth it. As for the 8K 30fps video, it records at 100 megabits per second and shares the 4K's kind of shaky and contrasty properties. It's cool to have, but I don't see anyone using this mode a lot due to it taking up double the amount of storage space, not being as smooth as the 60p and the overkill resolution. Xiaomi's camera app is pretty good in my opinion. There are plenty of modes and features and everything you need is there, but there is a strange layout. Whoever made the decision to put the macro mode in the photo mode instead of on its own little section on the carousel with the rest of the modes needs a stern talking to, and the default beauty modes are annoying and shouldn't be on by default. So with the Poco F2 Pro, were the right corners cut in the name of value? Well, I believe so. The lack of high refresh rate display, the lack of a telephoto camera, and the lack of wireless charging are all made up for, and the fact that the F2 Pro no longer feels like a compromise when you throw away the spec sheet and you actually use the thing. The original Pocophone was plastic, it had a subpar display, the camera really wasn't all there. The F2 Pro is glass and metal with a good quality OLED screen, and a camera that feels good enough. For $499, there are very few phones with a Snapdragon 865 that feel as well put together as the F2 Pro. It's not for everyone, and it's not perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than its predecessor. Alright guys, that's the end of the video. Hopefully you all enjoyed the Poco F2 Pro review, as it was a fun one to put together. Please do like, comment and subscribe if you're new around here to never miss a video like this one, and also check out the article which I will leave the link for in the video description. I've been Ryan Thomas of Android Authority, and I'll catch you later.